The morning sun cast long shadows across Harold Matthews' front porch as he slowly rocked in his favorite wooden chair. At 93 years old, his movements were careful but deliberate, much like everything else he did in life. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gently held a steaming cup of black coffee, the same way he had enjoyed it for the past 7 decades. Harold's modest white house sat on the corner of Maple and Oak Street in the small town of Millbrook. It wasn't the biggest or the fanciest home in the neighborhood, but to Harold, it was paradise. He had bought it in 1946 with his military pay after returning from World War II, and every crack in the walls held a memory. The front yard was Harold's pride and joy. Unlike other veterans who collected medals or war memorabilia, Harold had poured his heart into creating a garden that celebrated life rather than remembering death. Beautiful red roses lined the white picket fence, while purple petunias and yellow daffodils created bright patches of color throughout the yard. The neighbors often stopped to admire his handiwork, and Harold would beam with pride when young children pointed at his colorful butterfly bushes. Every morning, after finishing his coffee and garden inspection, Harold would put on his navy blue veteran's cap and walk the 3 blocks to the local Veterans Memorial. His pace was slow but steady, supported by a polished wooden cane that his late wife Martha had given him on their 50th anniversary. The local kids knew his routine so well that they would often wait to help him cross the street, even though Harold insisted he could manage on his own. The memorial was a peaceful place, featuring a granite wall with the names of local heroes who had given their lives for their country. Harold knew many of these names personally, boys he had grown up with, men he had fought alongside. Every morning, he would spend an hour there, cleaning any debris from around the memorial and making sure the small American flags placed by each name stood straight and proud. Mrs. Thompson from the corner bakery would often bring him fresh cookies while he sat on the memorial bench. "You're keeping them company, aren't you, Harold?" she would say with a gentle smile, knowing that for him, these weren't just names carved in stone. They were friends who never made it home. Life had fallen into this comfortable routine for Harold after Martha passed away 5 years ago. Their children, now grown with families of their own, lived in different states but called regularly. Sarah, his daughter, was a teacher in Ohio, while his son James worked as a doctor in California. They worried about their father living alone, but Harold assured them he was perfectly fine. The truth was, he found peace in his solitude and purpose in maintaining both his garden and the memorial. The local community looked out for him too. Officer Jenkins would drive by his house every evening, giving a friendly wave. The grocery store staff always helped carry his bags to the car, and the local diner had what they called the Harold Special: scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, and hash browns, just the way he liked them. But lately, things had started to change in Millbrook. The town was growing, bringing in new faces and new attitudes. Harold didn't mind progress. He had seen enough of the world to know that change was inevitable. However, the peace he had grown accustomed to was about to be tested in ways he never expected. It started with the rumble of motorcycles. At first, it was just 1 or 2 bikes passing through town. Then a group of them began gathering in the parking lot next to the Veterans Memorial. Their loud engines and boisterous laughter shattered the contemplative atmosphere that Harold and others had always treasured. Harold watched from his usual bench as they arrived each day, their leather jackets adorned with patches he didn't understand, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. He noticed how other visitors to the memorial would hurry past, how mothers would pull their children closer when walking by the parking lot. As he sat there on this particular morning, watching the first few bikers arrive for the day, Harold couldn't help but feel a slight tremor in his hand, not from fear, but from a deep sense that the peaceful life he had built was about to face its greatest challenge since the war. Little did he know that the events about to unfold would not only change his life, but would leave a lasting impact on the entire town of Millbrook. The leader of the motorcycle group was hard to miss. Everyone called him Snake, though Harold doubted that was his real name. Snake stood over 6 feet tall, with tattoos covering his muscular arms and a thick black beard that couldn't hide his youthful face. He couldn't have been more than 30 years old, but his presence commanded respect from the other bikers. At first, the bikers simply ignored Harold during his daily visits to the memorial. But as days passed, Snake began to notice the old veterans' disapproving glances at their loud bikes and rowdy behavior. The group had turned the memorial's parking lot into their unofficial clubhouse, leaving behind cigarette butts and empty beer cans each night. One quiet Tuesday morning, Harold was sitting on his usual bench when Snake revved his motorcycle engine so loud that it made the old man jump. The other bikers laughed, and Snake smiled, showing off a gold tooth that caught the morning sun. Harold's hands tightened around his wooden cane, but he kept his face calm, just as he had learned to do during tense moments in the war. "Hey, old-timer," Snake called out, walking toward Harold with an exaggerated swagger. "Don't you have somewhere else to be? A bingo game, maybe?" The other bikers snickered, forming a loose circle around their leader. Harold looked straight into Snake's eyes and spoke softly but clearly. "This is a place of respect, young man. These names on this wall, they died so you could be free to ride that motorcycle of yours." Snake's smile disappeared. He leaned down, putting his face close to Harold's. "Listen, Grandpa. Times have changed. Nobody cares about your old war stories anymore. This is our spot now." The confrontation caught the attention of Mrs. Thompson, who was walking by with her morning delivery of cookies. She hurried over, her gray hair bouncing with each step. "Is everything all right, Harold?" she asked, giving Snake a stern look. "Everything's fine, Betty," Harold assured her, though his voice trembled slightly. "These young men were just leaving." Snake straightened up and laughed. "Actually, we're just getting started." He turned to his group. "Boys, let's give our friend here a proper welcome." On cue, they'd all started their engines, creating a deafening roar that echoed off the memorial wall. Mrs. Thompson covered her ears and hurried away, looking back worriedly at Harold. But the old veteran sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the names carved in granite. This seemed to irritate Snake even more. Over the next few weeks, the intimidation grew worse. Whenever Harold appeared for his morning visit, the bikers would create some kind of disturbance. They played loud music from their bike speakers, told crude jokes within earshot, and sometimes circled the parking lot repeatedly, creating clouds of exhaust. Word spread through town about the situation. Officer Jenkins tried to talk to the bikers about noise violations, but they always behaved perfectly when police were around. Some younger veterans offered to stand guard with Harold, but he politely declined. "This is my battle," he would tell them with a sad smile. One morning, Snake approached Harold again, this time holding a half-empty energy drink can. "You know what your problem is, old man?" he said, taking a long sip. "You think you own this place because of what happened 1,000,000 years ago. But guess what? That war's over. Nobody gives a damn anymore." Harold watched as Snake deliberately poured the rest of his drink onto the memorial's base, the bright green liquid running down the granite surface. The other bikers hooted and clapped. That evening, as Harold sat in his favorite porch chair, he noticed more motorcycles than usual arriving at the memorial. Through the twilight, he could see them gathering in larger numbers, their bikes' headlights illuminating the darkness like angry eyes. Mrs. Thompson called him later that night. "Harold, you should see what they're doing now," she said, her voice shaking. "They're having some kind of party right there at the memorial. There must be 30 of them." Harold thanked her for letting him know and slowly placed the phone back in its cradle. He walked to his window and looked toward the memorial, where he could see the distant glow of motorcycles' lights and hear the faint sound of laughter carried on the evening breeze. For the first time since returning from the war, Harold felt the old familiar sensation of adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. Something had to be done, and Harold Matthews knew exactly what that something would be. As he walked to his closet, his steps were surer than they had been in years. The following morning dawned gray and cold, unusual for that time of year. Harold woke up earlier than usual, something in his gut telling him that today would be different. As he made his way to the front door for his usual garden inspection, his hand paused on the doorknob. Through the window, something looked wrong. When he stepped outside, Harold's heart nearly stopped. His beautiful garden, the pride of his life for the past 30 years, lay in ruins. Deep motorcycle tire tracks cut through his flower beds like ugly scars. His prized roses were crushed, petals scattered across the mud like drops of blood. The white picket fence had been knocked down in several places, and spray-painted symbols covered what remained standing. Harold's legs felt weak, and he had to lean heavily on his cane. Mrs. Thompson, who had been opening her bakery across the street, came running when she saw him standing there. "Oh, Harold," she gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "Who would do such a terrible thing?" But Harold didn't answer. His eyes had caught something in the distance that made his blood run even colder. Without a word to Mrs. Thompson, he began walking toward the Veterans Memorial, his cane striking the sidewalk with determined taps. The sight that greeted him was even worse than his garden. The memorial wall had been defaced with graffiti. Crude drawings and offensive words covered the sacred names of fallen soldiers. Empty beer bottles littered the ground, and someone had stuck cigarette butts in the holders meant for American flags. Officer Jenkins was already there, taking photographs with his phone and shaking his head. When he saw Harold approaching, he quickly stepped forward. "Mr. Matthews," he said gently, trying to block the old veteran's view of the vandalism. "Maybe you shouldn't be here right now. We're going to clean this up, I promise." But Harold walked past him, his eyes fixed on the desecrated memorial. He reached out one trembling hand and touched the name of Jimmy Morrison, his best friend who had died saving 3 other soldiers in the Pacific. Jimmy's name was now partially covered by a spray-painted snake symbol. "I know who did this," Harold said quietly, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. Officer Jenkins nodded. "We all know it was Snake and his gang, Mr. Matthews, but proving it is another matter. They're careful not to leave evidence, and none of the security cameras caught them in the act." "What about my garden?" Harold asked, still staring at the memorial. "Same thing, sir. We can file a report, but without proof." Officer Jenkins trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Maybe it would be best if you stayed away from the memorial for a while. These guys, they're not just troublemakers anymore. They're dangerous." Harold turned to look at the young police officer, and something in the old man's eyes made Jenkins step back. It wasn't fear or sadness in those eyes. It was something harder, something that reminded Jenkins that this gentle gardener had once been a warrior. Throughout the day, people from town came to offer their support. The local gardening club volunteered to help restore Harold's flower beds. A group of high school students offered to repaint his fence. Even the town council held an emergency meeting to discuss increasing police patrols in the area. But Harold barely heard their offers. He sat in his study all day, looking through an old trunk he hadn't opened in decades. Inside were his military records, medals, and photographs from his time in the Pacific. One photo, in particular, caught his attention. A group shot of his Marine Raiders unit, all young men with serious faces and deadly skills. As evening approached, Harold could hear the motorcycles returning to the memorial parking lot. Their engines seemed louder than ever, their riders more boisterous, probably celebrating their night's work. Through his window, you could see Snake holding court among his followers, gesturing proudly at the defaced memorial. Harold stood up slowly, his decision made. He walked to his closet and pulled out a garment bag he hadn't touched in years. Inside was his Marine Corps dress blue uniform, still perfectly pressed, his medals and ribbons still gleaming. "Enough is enough," he whispered to himself as he began to dress. The uniform still fit, though a bit looser now. As he straightened his tie and pinned on his medals, Harold caught his reflection in the mirror. Despite his age, his posture was perfect, his bearing unmistakably military. Tonight, he would remind everyone why the greatest generation had earned its name. As Harold stood in his study wearing his dress blues, his eyes fell on an old wooden box pushed far back on the top shelf. He hadn't opened it since moving into this house after the war. With careful movements, he brought it down and placed it on his desk, wiping away years of dust with his sleeve. Inside the box lay memories he had tried to forget. There were worn photographs, yellowed with age, showing a much younger Harold with his elite Marine Raiders unit. His fingers trembled as he picked up one particular photo. A group of young men standing in front of a jungle backdrop, their faces serious and their eyes hard. He was the only one still alive from that picture. The Ghost Unit, people had called them during the war. They were specialists in night operations, trained to move silently through enemy territory. Harold had been their best scout, able to navigate through pitch-black jungles using only his senses. His commanders had praised his unusual combination of patience and decisive action. A small leather notebook caught his attention. Opening it released the musty smell of old paper and distant memories. Inside were his mission notes, written in careful handwriting. Day 147, moved through enemy lines undetected, team of 6, no casualties, mission successful. Day 189, night infiltration of enemy base, retrieved vital intelligence. 2 enemy encounters, handled silently. Day 236, rescued 3 downed pilots, evaded enemy patrols for 4 days, all returned safely. Harold closed the notebook slowly. These weren't just mission reports. They were reminders of who he had been. The quiet gardener of Millbrook had once been a shadow in the night, a warrior who could move unseen and strike without warning. Beneath the photos and papers lay his combat knife, still in its original sheath. He had kept it clean and sharp all these years, though he told himself it was just out of habit. The weight of it in his hands brought back muscle memories he thought he had forgotten. A sudden roar of motorcycles outside pulled him from his thoughts. Through his window, he could see Snake and his gang arriving at the memorial again. They were laughing and pointing at the graffiti they had left, their voices carrying through the evening air. Harold watched as Snake walked up to the memorial wall and casually leaned against it, lighting a cigarette. The young man had no idea that the gentle old veteran he enjoyed tormenting had once been trained in ways that would make his blood run cold. Martha had known about his past, of course. She was the one who helped him build a peaceful life after the war, who understood why he needed to create beauty in his garden rather than dwell on the violence of his past. Your hands were made for more than war, she used to say while they planted roses together. But Martha wasn't here anymore, and Harold's carefully built peace had been shattered. He looked down at his medals, the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Combat V, the Purple Heart. Each one represented moments when peace hadn't been an option, when action had been the only choice. His fingers traced the Marine Raiders' insignia on his old combat jacket. The skills were still there, buried deep but not forgotten. Like riding a bicycle, some things you never truly forget. The way to move without being seen, how to approach an enemy silently, the art of using an opponent's strength against them, it was all still there waiting. Harold sat down at his desk and began to write a letter. If things went wrong tomorrow, he wanted people to understand why he had to act. He explained about his unit, about the years of training, about why he had chosen peace for so long. He wrote about Martha, about his garden, about the sanctity of the memorial. As he finished the letter, he heard more motorcycles arriving. The gang's laughter grew louder, their music starting to blast through powerful speakers. They were celebrating their vandalism, proud of destroying an old man's garden and defacing a memorial to fallen heroes. Harold sealed the letter and placed it in his desk drawer. Standing up, he walked to his window and watched the bikers for a long moment. His reflection in the glass showed not a fragile 93-year-old man, but a Marine Raider preparing for one last mission. Tomorrow, Snake and his gang would learn why you should never underestimate a veteran of the greatest generation. Tomorrow, they would discover that some old men are best left in peace. The next morning arrived with an unusual silence. The town of Millbrook seemed to hold its breath as Harold Matthews stepped out of his house at exactly 9 a.m. He wasn't wearing his usual gardening clothes or even his simple veteran's cap. Instead, he stood tall in his perfectly pressed Marine Corps dress blues, every medal and ribbon telling its own story of courage and sacrifice. Mrs. Thompson, who was sweeping her bakery's front step, dropped her broom when she saw him. Other townspeople stopped in their tracks, staring in amazement. Even Officer Jenkins, driving by on his morning patrol, pulled over to watch. None of them had ever seen Harold like this. He looked like a warrior from another time. The sound of motorcycles filled the air as Snake's gang began arriving at their usual spot by the memorial. They came roaring in one by one, chrome gleaming in the morning sun, music blasting from their speakers. Snake sat on his bike at the center of the group, holding court like a king on his throne. Harold began his walk toward the memorial. His cane was nowhere to be seen today. Each step was measured and purposeful, his back straight despite his 93 years. The medals on his chest caught the sunlight, sending bright flashes across the street. As he approached the gang, the bikers began to notice him. Their laughter died down, replaced by confused murmurs. Snake, who had been telling a loud story, stopped mid-sentence when he saw the old veteran approaching. "Well, look who's playing dress-up," Snake called out, trying to sound amused. But there was something about Harold's steady advance that made his voice waver slightly. Harold didn't stop until he stood directly in front of Snake, barely 3 feet away from the motorcycle. The other bikers formed a loose circle around them, some reaching for their phones to record what they thought would be another chance to mock the old man. But Harold didn't look like an old man anymore. His eyes, usually gentle and tired, now held a hardness that made several bikers step back involuntarily. When he spoke, his voice carried across the parking lot with surprising strength. I see you boys like to play war, Harold said, his words precise and calm. Let me tell you about real war. Before Snake could reply with his usual mockery, Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up so everyone could see the young Marines in the jungle, their faces streaked with camouflage paint. This was my Raiders unit, Harold continued, taking a step closer to Snake. 19 men. Special operations. We moved through the darkness like ghosts. The enemy never saw us coming, never knew we were there until it was too late. Snake tried to laugh, but it came out weak. That was a long time ago, old man. You're right, Harold nodded, taking another step forward. His next words came out barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard them. And in all those years, no one has ever made me consider using those skills again. Until now. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Snake's face had lost its usual smirk, replaced by something that looked very much like uncertainty. Harold's eyes moved from one biker to another, seeming to measure each one. Some of them found themselves touching their necks or taking small steps backward, though they couldn't explain why. There was something in the old veteran's gaze that spoke of capabilities they didn't want to test. I could show you exactly how we dealt with threats in the Pacific, Harold said softly. I could demonstrate right now why they called us the Ghost Unit, why the enemy feared the night. His hand moved slightly, and several bikers flinched, though he had made no threatening gesture. Snake's attempt at bravado crumbled as Harold's eyes locked onto his. For the first time, the young biker saw past the age, past the wrinkles and white hair, and glimpsed the warrior who still lived within the old man. In that moment, Snake realized he had badly underestimated who, and what, he had been tormenting. The morning sun cast Harold's shadow long across the parking lot, and in that shadow, the bikers could almost see the young Marine he had once been. The air grew thick with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Harold Matthews, the quiet gardener of Millbrook, had shown his other face, and it was a face that demanded respect. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife as Harold stood before the group of bikers. Instead of attacking or threatening them as they feared he might, he did something unexpected. He walked over to the memorial wall, touched one of the names gently, and began to speak. James Morrison, Harold said, his voice carrying across the silent parking lot. We called him Jimmy. He was 22 years old when he jumped on a grenade to save 3 other Marines. His fingers moved to another name. Thomas Chen, 19 years old. Carried 2 wounded men through enemy fire. Never made it home to meet his newborn daughter. Snake and his gang stood frozen, watching as Harold moved slowly along the wall. The old veteran's voice grew stronger with each name he touched, each story he shared. The morning sun cast long shadows behind them all, stretching across the ground like silent witnesses to this moment. You see these names? Harold turned to face the bikers. They're not just letters carved in stone. They were real people, young men, just like you, who loved to laugh, who had dreams, who wanted to live. He paused, looking directly at Snake. They died protecting the very freedom you used to disrespect their memory. Snake shifted uncomfortably on his feet, his usual confident swagger nowhere to be seen. Harold noticed the young man's hands were trembling slightly. You know what the worst part of war is? Harold continued, his voice growing softer. It's not the fighting. It's not even the dying. It's living with it afterward. Every night, I still hear the sounds of battle. I see the faces of men I couldn't save. I remember the weight of my friends as I carried their bodies back to safety. Several of the bikers removed their sunglasses, revealing eyes that had lost their earlier hostility. A few hung their heads, unable to meet Harold's steady gaze. I didn't enjoy killing, Harold said, his words heavy with emotion. None of us did. We did it because we had to protect our homes, our families, our way of life. When I came back, I planted a garden because I needed to create life instead of taking it. I needed to see beautiful things grow where once I had only seen destruction. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another photograph, this one showing his Marine unit standing proudly together. Out of these 19 men, only 3 came home. The others? He gestured to the memorial wall. Their names are right here, along with thousands more who gave everything they had so you could be free. Snake took a hesitant step forward, his eyes drawn to the photograph. Harold held it out to him, and the young biker took it with unexpectedly gentle hands. My grandfather. Snake's voice cracked slightly. He served in Vietnam. I never met him. He died before I was born. What was his name? Harold asked quietly. Robert. Robert Martinez. Snake replied, his tough guy facade crumbling further. Mom says he was never the same after the war. She said he would wake up screaming sometimes. Harold nodded slowly. The war stays with you. It becomes part of who you are. That's why places like this memorial are so important. They're not just walls with names. They're sacred ground. They're where we remember the cost of freedom. One by one, the bikers began removing their caps and bandanas. The morning breeze carried the sound of distant traffic, but in that parking lot, the silence was profound. I could tell you stories that would give you nightmares, Harold continued. About jungle warfare, about watching friends die, about making choices no young man should have to make. But instead, I'll tell you this. Every name on this wall represents a person who believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed in duty, honor, and sacrifice. He turned back to the wall, running his hand along the smooth stone. When you spray paint over these names, you're not just vandalizing a wall. You're trying to erase their sacrifice. When you disrespect this place, you're not just being rebellious. You're dishonoring men and women who died so you could have the right to be here. The weight of Harold's words seemed to settle over the group like a heavy blanket. Some of the bikers were openly wiping their eyes now, while others stared at the ground, shoulders stumped with shame. Snake still held the photograph, looking at the young faces frozen in time, perhaps seeing his grandfather's generation in a new light for the first time. Snake's hands trembled as he reached up and removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that had grown red with emotion. The tough biker leader looked different now, younger, more vulnerable. He kept staring at the old photograph Harold had given him, his fingers tracing the edges with unexpected gentleness. My mom, Snake said, his voice barely above a whisper. She has a box of my grandfather's things from Vietnam. I've never even looked inside it. He swallowed hard, looking up at Harold. She said it was too painful to open. Harold nodded understanding. War leaves deep wounds, son. Not all of them are visible. One of the other bikers, a tall man with a graying beard, stepped forward. My dad served in Desert Storm, he said. He never talks about it. Never. But sometimes, when he thinks no one's watching, he sits in his garage and just stares at nothing. More bikers began to speak up, sharing stories they'd never told each other before. One had an uncle who served in Afghanistan. Another had a sister currently deployed overseas. Beneath their leather jackets and tough exteriors, many of them had connections to military service they'd never acknowledged. Snake walked slowly to the memorial wall, his boots scraping against the concrete. He stopped at a section covered in graffiti, the graffiti. His own tag, a crude snake symbol, stretched across several names. For the first time, he really looked at what they had done. Snake's voice cracked. I never knew their names were under here. I never thought about them being real people. He turned to his gang, his face showing a mix of shame and determination. We need to clean this up. All of it. Now. Without waiting for anyone's response, Snake took off his leather jacket and began trying to rub off the graffiti with his sleeve. Other bikers quickly joined him, some running to their bikes to get water bottles and rags. The sound of their efforts filled the morning air. Harold watched as these men, who had caused so much trouble, now worked desperately to undo their damage. Mrs. Thompson appeared with cleaning supplies from her bakery, and soon other townspeople joined in, working alongside the bikers to restore the memorial. Snake worked harder than anyone, scrubbing at the wall until his hands were raw. As the graffiti slowly disappeared, the names beneath began to emerge again. He read each one aloud as it became visible, as if trying to apologize to each fallen soldier personally. Mr. Matthews, Snake said suddenly, turning to Harold. My real name is Michael. Michael Martinez. He stood up straight, wiping sweat from his forehead. I've been hiding behind that Snake nickname because I thought it made me sound tough. But my grandfather was tough, real tough. He earned his respect. I've just been playing at it. Harold placed a hand on Michael's shoulder. Your grandfather would be proud to see you right now, son. This moment, right here, this is real strength. Tears rolled down Michael's cheeks, but he didn't try to hide them anymore. Some of his fellow bikers patted his back supportively, their own eyes glistening. "We're going to make this right," Michael said firmly. "Not just the wall, everything. Your garden too, sir. We'll fix it all." He looked at his gang, who nodded in agreement. "And then, if you're willing, would you tell us more about these men? About your time in the war? About my grandfather's generation?" Harold smiled gently. "I think that could be arranged." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. The bikers worked tirelessly, cleaning every inch of the memorial. Some of the younger ones took notes as Harold shared stories about the names on the wall. Officer Jenkins stopped by and ended up joining them, sharing coffee and donuts that Mrs. Thompson brought over. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the memorial began to shine again. The names of the fallen emerged from beneath the vandalism, each one a reminder of sacrifice and honor. But something else was emerging too: understanding, respect, and a bridge between generations. Michael stood back, looking at their work. He pulled out his phone and deleted several photos of their previous vandalism. Then he took a new picture, one of the clean memorial, with Harold standing proudly in his dress blues beside it. "This," Michael said quietly, "this is what we should have been protecting all along." 3 months had passed since that transformative morning at the memorial, and Millbrook had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The Veterans Memorial parking lot was still filled with motorcycles most days, but now they were parked in neat rows, their chrome polished to mirror shine. Every Saturday morning, the sound of engines would echo through the streets as Michael, no longer called Snake, led his group to Harold's house. Today was no different. Harold sat in his restored garden, watching as the bikers arrived one by one. His flower beds were more beautiful than ever, tended not just by him now, but by rough hands that had learned to be gentle. Michael had discovered he had a natural talent for growing roses, something that would have seemed impossible just months ago. "Morning, Mr. Matthews," Michael called out, pulling off his helmet. He was wearing a new leather jacket, and on the back, instead of gang symbols, was an embroidered Marine Corps emblem, a tribute to his grandfather. The other bikers gathered around as Harold began his weekly stories. These Saturday morning talks had become famous in town. People would bring lawn chairs and sit in Harold's garden, listening as he shared tales of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. Today, there were over 50 people spread across his lawn. "Tell us about the night mission in Guadalcanal again," one of the younger bikers asked eagerly. He had enlisted in the Marines himself last month, inspired by Harold's stories. Harold smiled, noting how different these men looked now. Gone were the hostile expressions and aggressive postures. Instead, they sat attentively, many taking notes. Some had brought their children, who played quietly in the background. "Before I start," Harold said, "I want to show you something." He pulled out a letter he'd received yesterday. "This is from the town council. They've officially designated our memorial as a protected historical site." And he paused, looking at Michael. "They've appointed a new group as its official guardians." Michael's eyes widened as Harold handed him the official document. "The Veterans Memorial Motorcycle Guard," he read aloud, his voice filled with pride. "That's us." Harold nodded. "You've earned it. In the past 3 months, you boys have shown what it truly means to respect and honor our fallen heroes." The transformation went beyond just the memorial. Every Wednesday, Michael and his group now escorted elderly veterans to their medical appointments. They had organized a scholarship fund for children of military families, funded by motorcycle rallies that drew riders from across the state. The parking lot that had once been their party spot was now a gathering place for veterans to share stories and find support. Mrs. Thompson, who now kept a special batch of cookies just for the bikers, stepped forward with tears in her eyes. "I have something to show you all too," she said, unfolding a newspaper. The front page showed a photograph of Harold in his dress blues, surrounded by Michael and his group, all standing proudly at the memorial. The headline read, "From Conflict to Conservation, How One Veteran Changed a Town." "But it wasn't just me," Harold said, looking around at the faces before him. "It was all of you. You just needed to be reminded of the heroes in your own families." Michael stood up, his voice strong with emotion. "Mr. Matthews, we have one more surprise." He motioned to his fellow riders, who wheeled out something covered with a cloth. When they pulled it away, Harold caught his breath. It was a beautiful bronze plaque, designed to be mounted at the memorial entrance. The inscription read, dedicated to Harold Matthews and the Ghost Unit, who taught us that it's never too late to learn respect, honor, and the true meaning of courage. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he read the words. His gaze moved from the plaque to his garden, where tough bikers now sat alongside townspeople, all united in their respect for sacrifice and service. Children played between the flower beds, occasionally stopping to listen to the stories being told. The memorial, visible in the distance, gleamed in the morning sun, its wall now protected by the very men who had once defaced it. You know, Harold said softly, Martha always told me my hands were made for more than war. She said they were made for creating beauty and teaching others. He looked at Michael, who now wore his grandfather's dog tags around his neck. She was right. Sometimes the greatest battles we fight aren't with weapons, but with wisdom and patience. The morning sun cast long shadows across the garden as Harold began his story about Guadalcanal. But this time, he added something new, a story about how peace can grow in the most unexpected places and how it's never too late for anyone to change.